Go, go, go.
Let's get stuck in some traffic.
Everyone just started hooting. What makes a good hybrid car?
Well, it needs to be brilliant in the city.
And further afield.
And of course, it needs to be efficient.
It also helps if it's cheap to buy. This is the new MG3. It's the cheapest full hybrid car you can buy, but is it any good? Or are you better off just buying a mild hybrid instead?
In this video, we're putting the new MG3 up against the new Suzuki Swift to find out. Hello Will, so what are we doing today?
Well, you are in the new MG3 and that is the cheapest full hybrid car that you can buy in the UK right now. I, on the other hand, am in a Suzuki Swift. It is not a full hybrid, but it is a mild hybrid. It's also new, it's a small hatchback like the MG3 and it costs about the same to buy. And we're going to spend the next 2 days hybrid working. So today we are going to be heading from our office in Twickenham in London to Canary Wharf. That's a huge financial district and effectively the office for more than 100,000 people. And then tomorrow we are going to be working from home and we're going to be doing that in Norfolk, and getting there will give us a chance to see what these cars are like in town, on the motorway and on some nicer country roads. We're also going to be finding out how practical they are, what their interiors are like, and then of course at the end we will crunch all of the numbers, work out which is the more efficient car, find out which is the cheapest overall in the long run, and of course pick a winner.
Sounds good. First, let's find out more about the cars that we've got here. So Will, you're in the all-new 4th generation Suzuki Swift.
I am, although calling it all new is maybe a bit of a stretch because it is built on the same platform as the previous generation Swift and it is exactly the same width and height to the millimetre. But really, whether you want to consider this a heavy update or an all-new car, the reality is that it does have an all-new engine. So it's a 1.2 litre 3-cylinder petrol, very unusually. By modern car standards, it is not turbocharged. It does have mild hybrid tech though, as I said earlier, but unlike most mild hybrids which have 48-volt electric systems, this has a 12-volt electric system. So really you might want to think of it as a mild hybrid. But that motor should give it a bit of a boost to improve fuel economy. But what about yours?
Well, that sounds pretty old school really compared to this, because this is the all-new MG3 and it's a full hybrid. And also, unlike the Swift, this is completely different to the car that it replaces. So it's on a new platform, it's got this new fancy hybrid setup here as well, and it's also, as you can see, bigger than the Swift.
A little bit bigger.
So, on paper, this could be more practical, it could be more fuel efficient as well with this hybrid setup, and generally just feel a lot more modern than that new Suzuki Swift.
Okay, so fancy hybrid tech, but what's the official fuel economy?
64.2 miles per gallon, officially.
Right. So that's exactly the same as the Swift. But we also know that Suzuki's, historically at least, have proved very efficient in real-world driving. So I am confident that when we actually do the brim-to-brim test at the end of this trip, this is going to work out more fuel efficient. What do you reckon?
Let's get on the road.
So Doug, how are you getting on? We're in the Rotherhithe Tunnel at the moment. What's your fuel economy looking like?
Well, it's been another thrilling morning of driving in London. We've been on the road for only 1 hour and 41 minutes and we've covered more than 16 miles, 16.4 miles to be exact. So the average speed so far has been around 10 miles an hour. And my average fuel economy, according to the trip computer, is 47.9 miles per gallon. So how does that compare to what you're getting at the minute?
So at the moment, my car is telling me I'm averaging 47.8 mpg, which is closer than I thought it would be.
That is very close, isn't it? Especially considering this is a fancy full hybrid. You would have thought this would have a much greater lead over your much more old school Suzuki Swift.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be verifying those figures later on, of course, with a brim-to-brim test.
Sure, and I wonder if something that's tampering with my fuel economy figure a bit is the climate control, because I've got it set to 21 degrees, automatic, exactly the same as you, but It is freezing in here. So I suspect the climate control is working quite hard, which obviously won't help my fuel economy. Are you feeling cold in the Swift as well?
I would estimate my interior is around about 21 degrees, which is very surprising given that I have set the temperature to 21 degrees.
Well, I've never ever felt so cold in 21 degrees, so I'm not sure I believe what the climate control is telling me. So Will, how are you getting on in the Swift in this town environment?
Yeah, not too bad really. It's a small car, small dimensions, so very easy to manoeuvre. Visibility is pretty good as well, quite slim pillars, particularly on the windscreen. But it is a manual, so obviously in this stop-start traffic, it does involve quite a lot of arm work. I'm stirring away with my left hand every time we come to a stop, every time we slow down. And also the stop-start system is quite sluggish as well. So in a lot of modern mild hybrids, they're very quick to fire up the engine. When you stop and you want to put away again, this not quite so much, it takes a while.
Well, I guess the MG3 is more relaxing in that respect, isn't it? Because I've got an automatic gearbox, so I don't have any gears that I need to change myself. And really, this should be the perfect environment for a car like this. It's a small hybrid, lots of stop-start traffic. But to be honest, I can already tell that this doesn't have the most sophisticated hybrid setup. Because, yes, things are relatively quiet, especially when you're not moving and the engine can just very discreetly turn itself off. But when you move away again, things do kind of judder into life. And I can even feel the seat kind of shaking as I move off when the engine kicks in. So it's definitely not the best hybrid system out there, but it is the cheapest.
That is a fair point.
We eventually made it to Canary Wharf, brimmed our tanks to collect our fuel economy data, and decided to take a closer look at the interiors of our contenders.
Now, Will, you remember the old MG3?
Very well.
The interior of that car was pretty grim, wasn't it?
It wasn't great.
I mean, to be honest, the best thing you could say about it was that it was cheap. This, by comparison, is a huge leap forwards for MG, and in fact it very closely resembles what you find in an MG4. So much so that this steering wheel looks basically identical, doesn't it?
This gear selector down here is very similar as well.
Sure, you've also got a fully digital driver display, you've got a touchscreen infotainment system up here as well. And for the main part, in this interior, you definitely don't get in here and immediately assume this is one of the cheapest new cars you can buy, because lots of the materials are really fairly decent. And okay, there are some cheaper stuff like hard plastics up on the dashboard and on the centre console down here, but the look, the layout in here is modern and decent by small car standards.
Yeah, I'd agree. And even this stuff on top of the dashboard here, yes, it's hard, but you only really notice that when you feel it, because it's textured quite nicely, but for £18,000 or there or thereabouts, it's certainly more than respectable.
And another step forwards for MG is this infotainment system, really. So again, in other MG cars that we've tried, they're quite hit and miss in terms of what's offered, but this does seem a little bit better than what we tried before. It's not a revelation because it still can be fairly inconsistent in its response times. And also I find that there are just too many small icons. The text is quite small. So a lot of the sub-menus can be quite baffling to decipher while you're driving in particular. And you get that as standard whether you go for the cheapest car or the most expensive one. It is a shame that there aren't more physical controls for it though. But one way around some of that is using these two star buttons on the steering wheel. You can program these to be shortcut buttons that in effect let you control certain things using the joysticks on the steering wheel, like the climate controls. And while there are some physical buttons down here for the climate, unfortunately you don't have the temperature or the fan speed, which are obviously the two most useful ones to have. So that is a shame.
Yeah, that is a bit of a shame. I would rather some physical controls down here. But you do get a pretty funky 360-degree camera, don't you? Is that standard on this version?
On the range-topping version of the MG3, you get that, and it is very helpful. Although, to be honest, I find that the times that it wants to turn on are not actually when you need it at all. And the button to get it to engage is quite difficult to find. But you can program it into one of these start buttons, which is helpful.
What happens if I activate steering with peace of mind?
I must admit, I have not got a clue, but I will experiment with that on the next bit of driving that we do.
Okay, I would be really interested to know that, because
sure
I've always wanted to steer my car with peace of mind. What's the driving position like?
Fundamentally, this is a pretty sound driving position, but there is one major flaw with this, and that is the fact that you can't adjust this steering wheel for reach, so it only moves up and down. You can't move it in and out, which, to be honest, on any new car is pretty terrible. It works for my driving position, but it's not something that is definitely going to work for everyone.
Yeah, that is a shame.
Should we look at the Swift?
Let's do it. Okay, so in here, first thing I want to show you, which is good news, is that you get reach adjustment for the steering wheel, not just height. So that means that really more people are going to find it easier to get comfortable in here than they would do in the MG.
That's fair.
The driving position is very good in other respects too. So the steering wheel, the seat and the pedals line up nicely with one another. And visibility is also a bit better as well. So you've got more upright pillars here. They're a little bit further away from you. And I just find it easier to see out of the car, particularly at junctions and roundabouts because of that. Things aren't perfect though. So the seats, when you first sit in them, as you just have here, you probably think, well, there's quite a lot of side bolstering there.
Much better in that respect than the MG3.
Yes, but when you have spent half an hour, 45 minutes behind the wheel, then you do start to wish there was a little bit more lower back support there. And there's nothing you can do about that because there's no adjustable lumbar support on any version of the Swift.
It's the same story in the MG3, and again, in that car, the seats just aren't great in terms of lower back support. They're also quite soft. And
yeah, I think that's something that you've kind of got to accept at this end of the market.
sure.
The interior, I would say, is a bit mixed. So you've got some nice textures on here, but as you can hear, a little bit more flimsy than it is in the MG, some of these plastics.
Yeah, it doesn't feel quite as robust as the MG3, does it?
It doesn't, but it does go some way towards making up for that because there are some different colours here. So you've got a sort of bitone effect with a cream bottom and a cream section in the middle here with some grey and some metal effect as well.
It's quite a simple thing, but it really does make a very big difference to car interiors, doesn't it?
It is. It's pretty cheery in here, I think, and it doesn't feel cheap and nasty.
No.
And that is the most important thing. You do also get some physical controls for the air conditioning. So in the MG3, you have to faff around with the touchscreen. Here, you've got this toggle switch. You just flick it up to raise the temperature. You've also got some auto buttons there as well. Now, I would prefer some proper dials for that, but this is really not too difficult to use while you're driving.
Comfortably better than the MG3.
It is. And above that, you will notice a touchscreen. The good news is it's quite high up, so I don't have to look down too much, and I think that is an area that it has a slight edge over the MG3. It isn't the best system though in other respects, so it takes a while sometimes when you press an icon for anything to actually happen. There's a good example of that. You've got these shortcut keys at the bottom there, but they're touch sensitive and you sometimes don't know whether you've pressed it properly. But the saving grace is you've got Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and all of today so far I've just been using that, so it's really the same as any other infotainment system in the world. So overall I would say these cars' interiors are pretty close. Would you agree?
Fairly similar, yeah. While this is brighter and nicer in that respect,
Better visibility?
the build quality is maybe a little bit better in the MG3,
I would agree.
but then the driving position's a bit better in this as well.
Should we call it a draw?
Let's call it a draw for now. Maybe there will be bigger differences on the road.
Let's find out.
So Will, we've made it to the east coast of England. How did you get on in the Swift on that journey?
It's better than I thought actually. Obviously small cheap car, but pretty good on the motorway. Performance wasn't an issue at all, even though this is not a particularly powerful car. It was reasonably refined, a bit of wind noise, that was my only complaint. And if the trip computer is to be believed, this car is averaging more than 60 miles per gallon since we left London.
More than 60?
Pretty impressed with, really.
That's beating this so far then.
Wow.
On the trip computer.
Real hybrid.
I know, which is a bit disappointing, isn't it? But really, for the most part, this was also fine on that journey. Pretty loud inside though, a lot of wind noise, a lot of road noise, so that did get a bit tiring, but performance is great and reasonably comfortable as well.
Okay, well we got plenty more driving tomorrow, so should we get some food and some sleep?
We have, let's go.
Okay, so before we hit the road, we are going to find out how practical our car's boots are. And one of the ways we do that is we see how many carry-on suitcases we can fit below the parcel shelf. So as you can see in the Swift, I prepared this earlier for you, 5 cases pretty easily, and you can close the boot without any problems at all, no parcel shelf cocking up.
That is a comfortable 5, isn't it?
It is.
Now, how many litres of storage do you have in here officially?
Officially 265. It's a small car, remember, so not a huge figure, but you can fit 5 cases in there.
That is pretty good. This though, 298 litres.
Wow.
So on paper, quite a bit bigger, and you can see it's a bigger car anyway, isn't it? So past them over here. So, just about 4.
Just about 4. Slightly odd arrangement there, but we've tried lots of different ways, and that's
Yeah.
the best we could do.
That's quite disappointing, really.
It is a bit.
An entire suitcase less than the Swift, which apparently has a smaller boot than this. And it's maybe because, does this have a more awkward shaped boot?
I think it's partly because of how reclined the backrest is.
Well, let me tell you something else bad about that backrest, because when it comes to split folding rear seats, if you want even more boot space than this, you can put the rear seats down. Unfortunately though, they only go down as one. So, and you have to unhook them from both sides at once.
That is quite annoying. So that is no passengers and a bigger boot.
No one sat in the back if you want a bit of extra space than what the boot offers.
That is a bit of a shame because that does get a traditional 60-40 split.
Okay, so bigger car, officially more litres of storage, and yet it seems, certainly for the boot, less practical.
Okay.
But what are they like in the rear seats?
Shall I jump in and find out? Okay, so getting into the back is not the easiest, to be honest, because there's quite a high sill here. And when you're inside, then knee room is okay, not a huge amount of space there. My shins are also against the front seat back. This seat in front is set up for my driving position. I'm just over 6 feet tall. And while we're on the subject of the driving position, I did actually find the lack of reach adjustment in the steering wheel a bit of a problem for me. I know you didn't. But yeah, back to space. Foot space is okay. The only thing is, if I try and lean back in my seat, my head just hits the ceiling, so I'm nowhere near the head restraint at all. That might as well not be there. And if I try to look at you, I have to duck because of the way this window line tapers towards the rear of the car. So overall, it's okay, but perhaps not as good as I was expecting, to be honest.
Well, let's see how it compares to the Swift.
Let's do that. Okay, so we're in the back of the Swift. This seat in front, again, is set up for my driving position. And it's better, you know? You've got a bit more knee room there. Foot space is just as good. I've also got a better view out. I'm not having to duck quite so much to see you. And it was easier to get in the car in the first place, actually, because of a slightly wider area to clamber through and a lower sill. So overall, better, but headroom, to be honest, is just as bad because, again, if I try to lean back, then I can't really use the head restraint at all. These are small cars. They're likely to have kids and smaller people in the back. But, you know, not too bad in here.
So, Swift, bigger boot,
Bigger boot,
slightly more practical in the rear seats.
agreed.
That's quite a shock result, isn't it?
For a smaller car, it is.
So we've driven these cars in the city, on the motorway, now on some twisty country roads, and the MG3 has been reasonably impressive. The thing that really stands out about this car, surprisingly, is the pace that's on offer. So it has a 1.5 litre 4-cylinder petrol engine with 101 brake horsepower, but it also has a 134 brake horsepower electric motor. So the combined system output of this car is not far off what's on offer from some hot hatches. And it means it can do 0 to 60 miles an hour in 8 seconds, which is not just quicker than the Swift, but loads of other small cars that this is up against. However, the way that it delivers its power is a bit unusual because off the line, it feels very, very quick and it pulls really well. But then, this has a 3-speed automatic gearbox for the engine, and the shifts between the gears are quite long and ponderous, so it can in effect mean if you're going flat out, then you're really quick off the line, then the engine kicks in, then there's a gear change and all the power kind of falls away, then it comes back in again, then it falls away a bit. So it's definitely not as smooth and relentless in its acceleration like an electric car can be from 0 to 60 miles an hour. But still, this is way quicker than all the other small cars that it's up against. In terms of other aspects of this car on the road, the ride hasn't been a problem at all. We've done a very, very long journey, and for the most part it's settled, even though it can kind of thump over potholes and harsh imperfections on the road. It is, though, a bit of a shame that there's quite so much noise in here, because the road noise does get pretty tiring after not very long.
Now, I have a far more basic hybrid setup in this car. because it's effectively a 12-volt car battery that drives a tiny electric motor and just gives the petrol engine a small amount of assistance to improve fuel economy. But because the setup is simple, it means this car is light, so it weighs less than a ton. And that's also good news for handling. This car is pretty agile. It's actually good fun to drive along a country road like this. It's helped by the fact that the steering is well judged for weighting. It's reasonably quick, but not so much that it makes the car feel nervous. And you get a good sense of connection with the front wheels as well. And it's a good thing this car is light in another respect, actually, because it doesn't have very much power. So as I said earlier, the 1.2 litre petrol engine that this car has is not turbocharged, so it only has 81 brake horsepower, but performance is absolutely fine. You can keep up with traffic fairly easily. And if you do want to rev the engine hard, yes, you won't be accelerating that quickly, but it sounds quite nice. It's reasonably smooth. This particular car has a manual gearbox. You can get an automatic version of the Swift, but really, if you're looking to save money, then you want to go for this manual, because the automatic, that pushes the price up and it worsens fuel economy. And it's a good gearbox. It's got a nicely judged weighting, positive shift action, and there's a feelsome clutch pedal as well. So yes, you might think that a manual gearbox is quite old school. Most cars these days, of course, have automatic gearboxes, but sometimes old school is the best. But anyway, I think I need to drive that MG3 to find out what all the fuss about that hybrid system is about. Okay, so I'm in the MG3 now, and the first thing that is very obvious is that there's a lot more road noise in this car. So it is noisier when you're driving along, particularly when you get above about 40 miles an hour. The driving position, I don't get on with that as well as I did in the Swift either. There is a weird lump right at the back of the seat in the base. And on top of that, as I mentioned earlier, there is no reach adjustment for the steering wheel. So I can't set things up quite how I want them to. On the plus side, this is a much faster car. Acceleration for a small car is actually really good. But I know what Doug means about the power delivery, because it's quite clunky and a bit weird, to be honest.
The Swift does feel like a lighter, more agile thing than the MG3, and the steering is a bit nicer as well. It's more naturally weighted than what you have in the MG3. It's not like this is some incredible performance car on the road and the MG3 is just a big tank that doesn't want to move. But still, this has the edge when it comes to handling. It's also got quite a nice manual gearbox. Yes, you do have to change gear yourself, but it's a nice gearbox to interact with. I do feel though that I'm moving around a bit more in the seat than I am in the MG3, so I think the ride is a little more unsettled in this car. But still, there isn't a huge difference really between the two small cars that we have on this test. So we're well on our way back to London now, and Will, this has been fairly surprising so far, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. I think despite being a smaller car, having a smaller footprint than the MG3, this has proved slightly more practical. And if the trip computer is to be believed, fuel economy is pretty spectacular. Of course, we'll be finding out if that's really the case when we brim these cars when we get back to London.
Yes, and then we will work out exactly how much they will cost to buy and run, and that will help us pick a winner.
Should we get some lunch and then head back to London?
Let's go. So how much did this trip cost us, and which car really is more economical? So let's talk about the city part of this trip first, where we covered just over 28 miles. In the MG3, I needed 2.7 litres of petrol, and it cost me exactly £4, and I averaged 47.5 miles per gallon.
Okay, not bad, but the Swift was even more economical. So I needed 2.56 litres of petrol. That cost me £3.78 in the day, at an average of 50.2 mpg. So despite the fact that the MG3 is a full hybrid, should be at home in the city, it wasn't quite as frugal as the Swift.
It wasn't, and then on the motorway we did just under 289 miles. I needed 24.67 litres of petrol, and it cost me, in the MG3, £41.91, and I averaged 53.2 miles per gallon, so better on the motorway than what I got in town.
Better than in town, but not as good as the Swift. So the Swift needed 22.21 litres of petrol for that same trip. That cost me £37.73 at an average of 59.1 mpg. So although the MG3, pretty good figure, better than a lot of non-hybrid cars like maybe the VW Polo or the Renault Clio would have achieved, not as good as the Swift.
Yes, maybe we could have put it in eco mode for the whole of this test and upped the regen braking, but we kept it in its normal modes, kept regen as it was straight out the box to try and keep it fair against the Swift. And we did test out those modes, see if it had a big impact on fuel economy on another trip, and it didn't really make a huge difference anyway.
No.
So a little disappointing perhaps that this fancy new MG3 isn't able to achieve better fuel economy than the Swift.
A little bit disappointing.
But fuel economy is one thing. What do they actually cost to buy? So what do we know about that?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. Good fuel economy is important, but you want to be considering how much you're spending in the long run. And we are focusing on the range-topping versions of both of these cars. There are cheaper trim levels on the MG3 and the Swift, and actually we'd probably recommend buying those because this is the budget end of the class, of course, and you still get plenty of equipment if you go for those cheaper trims. But if you go for a range-topping version, then you'll pay a little bit more for the MG to begin with, but it is predicted to hold on to its value slightly better. So when you factor in depreciation, fuel, insurance, servicing, then there's very little in it, but the MG3 will probably work out about £150 cheaper to own over 3 years.
Right, okay. But really few people are going to be buying these cars in cash, are they? It's much more likely that they're going to be taking out a monthly PCP finance deal. So is it the same story?
Well, that's a good point, because £20,000 is still an awful lot of money for most people. They're unlikely to be paying the whole lot in one go. So if you are signing up to a typical 4-year PCP finance agreement in these cars, the Swift will work out about £17 a month cheaper.
Okay, so in favour of the Swift then. The MG3 is better equipped though, so it gets a heated steering wheel in this range-topping trim. It gets a 360-degree camera as well. The Swift doesn't get either of those things, but we're not really talking about huge differences between them. And as you say, we would probably point people towards the entry-level versions of these cars anyway, which are still very well equipped for entry-level trims. Is there anything else we need to weigh up before we pick a winner between these two?
Well, we've covered most things, but one thing we haven't talked about is safety. So just because you're not spending a lot of money on your new car doesn't mean you're going to want to sacrifice safety for yourself and potentially your family as well. And neither of these cars has been crash tested by Euro NCAP at the time of recording. Now, MG in recent years has proved it can build some pretty safe cars. So we've seen the MG4 and the MG HS get 5-star out of 5 Euro NCAP safety ratings. Suzuki, on the other hand, not so much. So the previous generation Swift, which obviously shares quite a lot in common with this latest version, that only achieved 4 stars way back in 2017 when the tests weren't as thorough as they are today. So right now, we can't really draw too many conclusions. We'll have to wait for those test results. But all we would say is that if safety is a priority, which it understandably might be, you might want to hold off on making a decision until those results are published.
Okay, but from what we do know right now, the Swift is a bit more practical.
It is.
It's a bit better to drive. It's more economical as well. And it's a bit cheaper on a monthly PCP finance deal. So it's the winner of this test, right?
It is, and I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people might be thinking, well, the MG is a much more powerful car than the Swift. You're comparing apples with oranges. But really, the performance in the Swift is perfectly adequate. The MG's a little bit faster, and most of the time, if you're looking to save money on fuel particularly, you won't be using that extra performance anyway.
Right, so a win for the Swift. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you want to see another one, then click up there. And if you want a great deal on your next car, go to whatcar.com by clicking there.